Hello, and welcome to week 89 of our 2-year Bible study. We are in the midst of the Gospels, and we begin this week with Matthew chapter 23. Um, Verses 1 through 11 of this chapter talk about the warning against hypocrisy. Um, I think it's important for us to think of this less about the rules of the Pharisees and instead about seeking humble living. Jesus does talk about the woes against the teachers of the law here, and I especially want to focus on verse 16 through 22. Woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools, which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes the gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing, but anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men, which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And anyone who swears by the temple swears by it and by the one who dwells in it. And everyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. The swearing or the oaths that are being talked about here is on anything associated with God, brings God into the oath. And so when we use God's name um, um, in a light way, in a non-sacred way, just because we're using it in a non-sacred way doesn't mean that we don't bring God into it. And so every oath, every swearing that we do brings God into that moment and into that oath. When we get to verse 32, um, it says that, well, we're going to talk, starting verse 29. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. This, of course, is about to be displayed later in this same week that Jesus is speaking to them. When we head on over to Luke chapter 20, we see that there's a considerable amount of parallel material here. I did want to focus in on verse 16. And this is the parable of the tenants, of course, as you've read. And we're going to start in verse 14. But when the tenants saw him, the son, they talked the matter over. This is the heir, they said. Let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and kill those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When the people heard this, they said, God forbid. Israel is illustrated to be God's vineyard. This comes out of Isaiah chapter 5, verse 7. And so they knew the story was about them. And yet still, we are moving towards the crucifixion of Jesus at the end of this week. So again, much of the rest of the material in Luke chapter 20 is parallel to material that we've already discussed. And the destruction of the temple in Luke chapter 21 is really beginning a focus on Jesus. Jesus provides the seasons that will come until he comes. And other than the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem beginning the age of the Gentiles, there is this sense in which we should expect those seasons to continue to repeat until he comes. And so we can expect his coming because the seasons have not ended yet. And he says this generation will not pass away. We've kind of talked about this in earlier summaries, but it could mean a double fulfillment. So Jesus' generation and the future generation at the end. So the generation at the end means the end is going to come quickly, but this generation equals the entire time of the Gentiles. So the generation will not pass away because everything from the resurrection of Jesus until his coming is the generation, the era, if you will. that will not pass away. But when the end comes, that generation that is living during that time will also not pass away, because the end will come very quickly. In Mark chapter 13, we have, again, a lot of parallel material here, but I think a consistent theme throughout this particular chapter is to be watchful and to be faithful as the days approach. When we go to Matthew chapter 24, this also will talks about the end of times, and there is much parallel material here from what we have already spoken about. In Matthew chapter 25, again, we have these consistent themes of be watchful, be faithful, serve always. And I think a really important verse in Matthew chapter 25 is verse 46, talking about the sheep and the goats. In verse 46, Jesus says, then they, the goats, will go away to eternal punishment, but the righteous to sheep to eternal life. And this is a really important verse because it couples eternal punishment with eternal life. For those who don't believe that there is an eternal punishment from God, this verse says it. And if you don't like that it says it here, you're not going to like the eternal life, which is mentioned in the very same verse. So you either have to have eternal life and eternal punishment, or have neither, because this verse necessarily links the two of them together. Much of Matthew 26 has some parallel material in it, but I do want to point out that the 30 pieces of silver in verse 15 was considered the price of a slave. So Exodus 21 verse 32 established that price, and the price given as payment for God's shepherd that is rejected in Zechariah chapter 11 verses 4 through 17. And so it shows the lowliness of Jesus. It shows the rejected shepherd of Jesus. And so through Zechariah, a prediction of the shepherd Israel is given over to the authorities for injustice. We have the Last Supper in Matthew chapter 26, the betrayal of Judas, the prophecy of the prediction of Peter's denial. We have all that happens in Gethsemane and Jesus' arrest. I think most of that is pretty straightforward to the reading of the material. And in verse 65, in verse 64, Jesus remained silent, and the high priest said to him, I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God. In verse 64, you have said so, Jesus replied, but I say to all of you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And they know that Jesus has spoken of himself as the Son of Man. So he is speaking of himself here. And then in verse 65, it says, then the high priest tore his clothes and said, he has spoken blasphemy. What do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. Verse 64 is seen as Jesus is equating himself with God. And we can see that based on the response from the religious leaders. So we see these chapters were beginning to shift into the passion of Christ in terms of his judgment by the religious leaders. Obviously, this is going to move into judgment from the Gentile leaders, represented by Pontius, and ultimately the crucifixion of Jesus as well.